The New America Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event on behalf of New America and our partners today in co-sponsoring this discussion, Google. Thanks to Bob Borston and his team for making this space available to us. It's a terrific place to talk. And also to Wired Magazine, whose editor, Nick Thompson, will be up here in a minute to monitor the discussion. My role is just briefly to introduce the panelists and to set the stage for today's discourse. New America you can read about by going to our website, www.newamerica.net, so I won't detain you, except to say that we're a think tank based in Washington. We have offices in California and a presence in New York. And in our support of scholars and policy thinkers and journalists, we're very much interested in ideas and research that will transform public policy and discourse about public policy in this country, particularly around the issues that are most critical in the United States today. And I think that theme of transformation is a pretty good place to start as we talk about transparency and governance in Washington at this time of profound change. I think every new president comes to this town wanting to do things differently. This has obviously been an unusual election in the profound sort of central place that ideas of transformative change have had at almost every level of the campaign. But one of the, I'm afraid, recurring narratives of Washington is what happens when change meets the irresistible entrenched forces of bureaucracy and governance and process in this town. And I think that is likely to emerge as we talk about transparency today, both the aspiration and the obstacle. It's really striking to us at New America that this particular event, this subject of transparent governance, how it might be achieved, what's reasonable to aspire to, and what the engineering looks like, has attracted so much interest. We had twice as many replies to today's invitation as we had space to accommodate. And in fact, there are people standing, so if you're sitting next to an empty chair, please put your hand up and let folks find their way forward, and others will stream through, I think, over the next few minutes. So there is the appetite, but now we'll hear about what the opportunity sounds like. And to lead us through that discussion are four people who have been working in this area long before it became so central and so fashionable. Immediately to my left is Ellen Miller, who is the executive director and founder of the Sunlight Foundation, which is a Washington-based nonprofit that has been urging the use of new technology to create greater transparency in government broadly and Congress in particular for some time. She knows of what she speaks, having spent a decade or more in Congress. And before she took on the Sunlight Foundation, she was the director of the Project for an Accountable Congress. Next to her is my colleague from the New America Foundation, Sasha, who is the research director of our Wireless Futures program, and he is an advocate of open source technology and policies that create the possibility of open source collaborative approaches to innovation, but also to governance and to public policy. And really an interesting thinker who tries to bring software writers and code writers to the policy debate from which they're often excluded to the detriment of that debate. Next down the line is Mindy Finn, who was the director of e-strategy for the Mitt Romney campaign and has been focused on using the web and technology and politics to empower voters and also to fund campaigns and mobilize activists for a long time. She served in a similar role in Rick Santorum's 2006 campaign and the deputy director of the RNC's e-campaign project. Before that, she's now at Engage, a media consulting firm here in town. And then finally, at the far end, Craig Newmark, the self-described customer service director of Craigslist, and an innovator in this space and in transparency and collaborative use of technology for a long while. He started Craigslist in 1995 after a long career as a code writer and software engineer himself. He was at Charles Schwab at the time when he started evangelizing about the internet, and building informal lists that ultimately evolved into the phenomenon that we all now know and use. Craig is an activist as well, and a blogger, and just a very sort of thoughtful contributor to the push for transparency and the use of technology to improve transparency and governance. He's involved in Sunlight and in many other endeavors that really put the rubber to the road in this area. So a terrific group, and to lead them through the discussion now, I turn the microphone over to Nick Thompson, who's also a New America Fellow, a senior editor at Wired magazine, and one of the better technology policy writers in the country. Nick.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Google. In the Department of Magazine Promotion, you should all know that the next issue of Wired will have a big article on the very topics we'll be discussing today. And in the Department of Full Disclosure, it will also contain an article called The Plot to Kill Google, written by me. It will make some people here unhappy, some people happy, but the plot will not succeed in the next hour and a half, so we can proceed. So today we want to talk about all the hopes and dreams for the Obama administration in technology, the ways they'll use technology to open up democracy. We're also going to take a realistic approach at what are some of the pitfalls, some of the obstacles. So let's start out with a minute or two from everybody on what you hope the Obama administration will be able to do with this amazing technology. So let's start, Ellen, a minute or two on what's going to happen that you really want to happen.
What will happen, or what I would like to see?
What you want to happen. No, we'll do what will happen later. Let's do what we want now.
All right, terrific. Well, I want to thank everybody who's responsible for putting this event together. It's clearly the topic of the week. I mean, I read two things this week, and I thought, wow, is everybody thinking about this particular event? One thing that was written that I thought was particularly important was by Tom Steinberg, who is the head of the well-recognized and deservedly so UK group called My Society. And I don't know what actually prompted him to write it, but he said the most scary thing about the internet for government is not pedophiles, terrorists, or viruses. It's the danger of your administration being silently obsoleted, which I don't think is a word, by the lightning pace at which the internet changes expectations. And I think that was just extraordinarily well said. And then literally the next day, or maybe the same day, actually this was Tuesday, I think I tweeted this as Transparency Tuesday. Mark Drapeau on Media Shift wrote sort of the answer to that, which is, the answer to the core question here, which is how are we going to use social software to increase communication, et cetera. And he said, social software has numerous government applications, including information sharing within and between agencies, collaborating with outside partners, public outreach, and crowdsourcing, empowering people with inexpensive, simple mobile technology. And to me, that's a pretty comprehensive statement. Let me sort of boil that down. I want to talk about three basic principles, because I think it's really important to be able to evaluate whether this administration's actions, in fact, fulfill the principles that all pertain to transforming government through the use of technology. The first one is that transparency is government's responsibility. This is a novel suggestion in this town. Well, I think the administration understands and really gets technology. Most people in Washington, most officials in Washington, really follow the adage of what my colleague Andrew Richet once said, which is they don't know the difference between a server and a waiter. And so it's really important for this administration to own the notion that transparency is government's responsibility. And in my mind, that means conceptually the government should be born open, not born secret. And so the administration has a lot of work to do to change that cultural perception that government information is my information, and you, the citizens, have to request it. And so that changes fundamentally what FOIA looks like, for sure. How would they go about implementing this? First 100 days, there should be an executive order that dictates that social media use of social media becomes a government-wide priority, identifying digital communications as a means for both communications and transparency. And I want to emphasize that those are two different things. Transparency is about what government does, what kind of data do they have, making it available to us. Communication is about how citizens are engaged. Second, to me, as important in this is a high-level CTO or CIO, preferably from my perspective, in the White House, who marshals government-wide use of technology on both these fronts, transparency and communications. I am convinced, for as many years as I've lived and worked around government, that without a high-level person to marshal this, that the best intentions will flounder. I'm absolutely convinced of that. So we need to have a high-level CTO and perhaps CIO as well. And the administration should have a nimble cross-agency group of people who care about use of technology, and new media high-level staff should be inserted into each agency. The second principle, and I'll go through these quickly, public means online. Everything else is online in a public fashion. I don't want to have to go any longer. If I want to research a lobbyist for a foreign government, I don't want to have to make an appointment to go to the Justice Department and find out that information. Everything should be made online. Third principle is that data quality and presentation matter. I know we'll talk later about some of the pitfalls that are here, but executive branch databases, as they are developed, should be designed for interoperability. We should be able to link not only amongst executive branch databases, but between executive branch databases and legislative branch databases, between judicial information. There's some other elements that maybe we can talk about later, but I think these three principles will serve as useful guideposts to all of us who want to urge, advocate, and work with the new administration and determine whether they are successful.
Great. I can assure you that transparency is an absolute commitment of the Obama administration. In the Wired piece, my favorite sentence that we edited out at the very end was, "Transparency is the most important principle of this administration," said an unnamed Obama aide who refused to allow his name to be quoted in the press. Sasha, a minute or two on briefly what exactly you want these people to do.
Sure thing. Let me just say, although Ellen and I did not coordinate our asks, I think you'll find many parallels between them, and I think it is indicative of the import of the changes that we're asking for. And let me start by saying that the Obama administration, perhaps more than any administration in recent memory certainly, has an unprecedented opportunity for disappointment. And the reason for this is that, we have fought for years for increased transparency, the elimination of needless secrecy, the restoration of this participatory decision-making that's so fundamental to a healthy democracy. And we look at what's happening right now, the transformations that are at our very doorstep, and we're full of hope that the change is more than just rhetoric and that we might see something meaningful down the road. And the openness of communication and the freedom of information dissemination are fundamental tenets. Some would argue that they're the hallmarks, in fact, for a healthy American democracy. And so with this new administration, we have this opportunity to reinvigorate civic engagement, and civic engagement writ large. The body politic is activated, we're energized in ways that we haven't seen in many, many, many years. And for me, the big question is, how do we focus this energy in a meaningful way? How can we use the capacity inherent in everyone in this room today? And how do we harness the expertise and the innovation and the acumen that are amongst all of us? And so my big ask, if you will, the easy win is to free up the flow of information, as Ellen said, and give residents and citizens unprecedented access to government data, not data necessarily in terms of all of the different proceedings and regulations and rulemaking and decision-making processes, but I'm actually talking about more specifically the statistical data that underlies a lot of what the government does. So a major failing of prior administrations, both Democrats and Republicans alike, has been their over-reliance on internal analyses and research. And it's time that we started to crowdsource a lot of this work. It's time that we use government experts to separate the wheat from the chaff, certainly, and to conduct the meta-analyses that are necessary, and to really refine the research that's being conducted and done elsewhere. But let's open up the initial data crunching to the general public. Let's open it up to all the institutions and the universities. Let's open up to the crazy guy in his garage that just cares about that one topic and has spent 35 years studying everything there is to know about it. Let's give those folks the data. And so what I would ask for would be this government-wide mega FOIA, a massive, systematic, systemic, agency-by-agency release of the primary data that's currently being used to generate government reports and findings.
Wow. Great. Mindy, one top recommendation for the Obama administration that you hope will happen.
Sure. Well, as I'm presuming the only right-of-center person on this panel, and maybe one of the few in the room, you might think that I would say that they take actions that lead to an all-caps fail. But that isn't the case at all, because in the roles that I've held, despite what I think some of you might believe, and I saw some smirking when Nick was going through my resume, I have advocated for the ideas of transparency, accountability from a national level, at political committee level, at a presidential campaign level, and certainly for the value of mass connectedness and mass participation. I agree with both Ellen and Sasha here that there should be ideally White House level CIO, CTO, and a committee that's pushing really standards onto all the government agencies. I think that absolutely has to happen. As someone who can't advocate for bigger government, I think at the same time, while we do that, and we're introducing technology and mass connectedness into all government agencies and into the White House, we need to eliminate what are likely many positions that have become outdated and outmoded. And I'd like to get into the conversation, so I'll stick with that major recommendation of the two panelists.
Great.
Just to be clear, I'm not customer service director. I report to that guy. I'm also not an activist, and politically, when I was here last, I told people I was shopping for a label. So far, the best I have is libertarian moderate. I have no idea where that places me these days, except good at oxymorons. But that's the position I take. The whole transparency stuff and a number of recommendations have already been covered by people here. Specifically, if you look at techpresident.com, folks from the Federal Web Managers Council have a list of specific recommendations for letting them do what they perceive as their jobs. There's a lot of bureaucratic inertia preventing them from doing it. There are some specific laws and regulations preventing them from doing it. But take a look at that, because that has very concrete, specific recommendations. It's as if my fellow nerds feel that they've been prevented from doing the right thing for some years, but they're writing as if they feel an age of darkness is lifting, speaking using a nerdish metaphor, and they're ready to go. So I'd say, like, free the nerds.
All right.
I also call, I think we're going to be seeing Obama call for national service in a lot of different ways. People are riffing on this awkward metaphor of a Craigslist for service. I'd add to Sasha, it's timed for a new kind of civic engagement to start, and I've actually called for a new kind of service in terms of online civic engagement and discussion. It's time for everyone in the country, if you have the time, become smart about one topic and get involved online. Finally, I don't think Obama should give up his BlackBerry.
All right. So we have a good agenda: openness, transparency, and free the nerds, Republican and Democratic. Let's talk about some of the obstacles to all the different parts of that. So let's start with you, Craig. So you do customer service, and you know what it's like when the nerds and Sasha's guy in the garage are actually free. And we know what it's like. We know the message boards on Free Republic or Daily Kos. They're crazy. You told me that yesterday you spent most of your morning knocking out 500 offensive comments on Craigslist. So let's say we start trying to have an open conversation through whitehouse.gov. We try to have some sort of big model. Aren't we just going to be inundated with lots and lots of trolls?
Well, the problem here is that if we get into this era of online civic discussion, trying to get continuous engagement with the government's customers, which is to say us, online in practice you see that there are people who will have ideas which are questionable, or there will be people there just trying to disrupt the conversation, just trying to pick fights to get attention. How are we going to deal with that? Probably what's happening right now is people are building discussion boards right now to deal with this, where the people who use these boards can work together to filter up or down, to vote up or down, comments and people who may be just there to contribute in a positive way, and then perhaps to vote down the stuff which is more questionable.
But isn't there a serious issue with that in the federal government? I mean, Craigslist, somebody puts something offensive, you can take it down because you're Craig. Federal government, we have the First Amendment.
Well, there are a bunch of serious problems with that, one of which will be that current law and regulation prevent a lot of that from going on. The federal web managers talk about that. One suggestion is to do this as a public-private partnership, and people are working on that now. There are other problems too, some intrinsic in the nature of democracy, where you get the problems where you got popularity contest issues, and that will continue to be an ongoing problem because it's intrinsic in democracy, like Winston Churchill reminded us. So we have a number of problems involved in there. A persistent problem will be those folks who are trying to pick fights, trying to put disinformation into the conversation, not just to get attention, but to get attention to cause fake arguments, sometimes to get billable hours. We saw a case of that where, well, the term for people who try to pick fights to get attention, we call them trolls. And that's a problem all the time on online discussion boards. My attention has been drawn to a variety of troll. A lot of them may live here, who will try to pick
You
fights.
please point them out.
Well, they'll try to pick fights in certain serious topics to prolong the fighting. There's an area of net neutrality where the different parties are actually much closer together than you think. And agreement is not far from our grasp if you can get rid of the people trying to pick fights, like recently in the Journal a week or two ago, who tried to manufacture a fake problem. Well, those kind of trolls are going to be a big problem.
All right, Mindy, let's talk about something very similar. You worked on a campaign, but there's a real difference from the way you try to activate people and get people excited during a campaign from the way you need to use them when you're governing. So Obama has this list of 13 million people, and they're the 13 million people you want to win a Democratic primary, and they're the 13 million people you want to win a general election, but they may not be the 13 million people you want setting government policy. So tell me about this tension, and tell me about a Twitter post you posted sometime after the election, and I believe it was just "Welcome to Power."
Yeah, Craig hit on one of the great challenges, which is that to have a truly open government and offer an open discussion, you tend to give an advantage to the loud and the angry. That's one challenge. The loud and the angry end up being the dominant voices and perhaps can discourage those who are not the loud and the angry, but do have something productive to offer. That's one challenge. The second challenge is that if you are reaching out to engaged communities, I know there's been discussion of the Obama team activating the 13 million list, keeping them active, which I think is a very smart thing to do. But if they're privy to a stronger relationship to the government, then are those 13 million having perhaps undue influence on the government's actions? Or, is it just a smokescreen where they're not actually having any impact, and you're communicating to them and making it seem that they're going to have an impact, and they don't? I think the difference, as Nick points out, when you're in a campaign, you're looking to win over a specific constituency, active voters, an active voting base. When you come to the government, you're supposedly going to be representing the entire nation, and Obama has been very clear about saying that he's going to reach across the aisle, he's going to reach into different banks, he wants to gain full popularity. We're seeing in some of his actions that he's very serious about doing that. But how do you make sure that other constituents, such as people who don't necessarily might not have voted for you or didn't vote for you as enthusiastically, have just as much say in what you're doing and are just as active? Now, I also think we get into a chicken and egg argument a little bit here, because in a truly open platform that encourages mass participation, it does favor the active. It does favor those who decide to log on, to communicate their views, to engage in discussion, to contact you with their views. However, and some might say, well, what about the 85% of the American public who's not doing that? But at the same time, if you are actually giving preference and listening to the views and being transparent about how those views are shaping your policies, then it encourages the 85% who are not active to become active. Perhaps the 85% is not active, or at least 50% of that 85% is not active because they've seen for years and years and years where their participation does not affect at all government policy.
So let me summarize that in a cynical way, which is you have all these people who support you, and you don't really want their feedback because they're not the people you want to have helping you govern, but you need to make it appear as though you're getting their feedback because then it will inspire all the other people to give you feedback, and then you'll really be able to govern right.
It's a huge challenge, and you're already seeing before Obama's even taken office that some of the most ardent supporters and early supporters are disappointed with the cabinet choices he's made, staff choices that he's making, the positions he's taking on policy, because those are not the policies that they advocated and vote, and that they felt he would advocate for while in office. And it's because he is trying to, I think, appeal and please a greater majority, which runs kind of more in the center.
Well, that actually is a nice opening. We'll switch to Ellen, who has been a public critic of something that the Obama administration has done, which is Obama came up and he gave a YouTube address. It was this wonderful transformational thing, the first internet presidency, fantastic, and Ellen gave a quote and said, well, actually, this really doesn't mean anything. It's the same as a radio address. It's not two-way because Obama had shut off comments in response to his YouTube address. So do you think that Obama did a good thing by going on YouTube, or do you think it was a sham? Do you think it was part of this conspiracy that I'm advocating for here?
Well, what I think is that the notion that the YouTube address is a new version and using new technology, a new way to deliver a Saturday morning radio address, was their first experimentation in using this, the new technology. But what's fascinating, I think, for all of what we're really talking about is the new technology is hugely experimental. So they tried that, and they saw they got some negative feedback, and they said, well, maybe we should do it differently, like maybe we should enable comments, which they have subsequently done. If you watch what's happening with change.gov, the first time they, I think, requested questions, what do you want to know? They put that up, there was no interactivity, and then they sort of announced, what the top questions were. The second round, they changed that as well. And so I think we are entering a stage in terms of using new technology, whether it's coming from the White House or from the government at large, of experimentation. Let's try it and work, and if not, we'll just iterate it. I mean, it's sort of the brilliance of the software developers, which is, here's our alpha, here's our beta. I'm cutting them a little bit of slack, only because I've seen them already start down this road.
Okay, but now maybe we shouldn't cut them slack. I read those YouTube comments once they opened up comments, and you all should read them too. I mean, they are things like Big Bear saying, rock on, Obama, and Acid Trout asking, who's the black guy, and free Mumia, and free Palestine. Like, what did we get out of that conversation?
Yeah. Here's what I think. I think you experiment in different arenas. So my next big arena for the Obama administration to experiment in is with this thing called the economic stimulus bill. For people who know my history, you may find it strange to find me agreeing with Senator Mitch McConnell, who said, I think the public ought to see this bill 7 days prior to our consideration of it. What he didn't say, and we were actually trying to press him, is, you want to see it online, right, Senator? Because, as I said earlier, public is, that means online. And I don't want to see it online as some 2,000-page PDF document either. I want to see it, in a way that you can annotate it. And I don't care whether 80, 90% of the comments are irrelevant, are stupid. I do care if they're, blasphemous or, really out of bounds. But what I'm looking for is the 10% of the people who contribute to that may have ideas, may have thoughts, and I think even for the people who say, this is the stupidest idea I ever heard, or worse, or really not contributing, it is a way of engaging them in the process of, democracy, practicing, developing bills. And so I think even though there'll be mistakes, even though there are stupid things that happen, there's less and less of that. We, Sunlight, put a model bill for government transparency online many months ago, maybe 8, 9 months ago. We just threw it open. We said, tell us what you think. And I was shocked that out of the, I can't remember, many hundred comments that we had, I don't think there were any other than some spam that we had to take down. Mm-hmm. So on a very small scale, what you see is more responsibility than one might expect.
Great. All right, Sasha, let's go to your very bold agenda of opening up all sorts of information. In fact, let's open up nearly everything the government has. Now, if we do that, the government has my Social Security number, they have my tax information, they have my record on my federal felonies, they have a lot of stuff that I don't want open. So let's talk about, and not only that, there's a good example. A lot of Obama's technology platform and campaign is based on that of Deval Patrick, the Massachusetts governor, and he tried to do a lot of these things, and he put a database up with all sorts of public information, and they tried to verify that the people using it are from Massachusetts, and when they did that, a lot of people started writing and saying, you know, you're able to get unlisted phone numbers off of this. And suddenly it turned into this big disaster and this conspiracy, and then everything he was trying to do was subsumed by trolls and 9/11 conspiracy theorists because there were unlisted phone numbers, and it turned into a complete disaster, and it blew all his plans. So, Sasha, what will be the Obama administration's first disaster, and how will they recover from that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, the choice you've made of a breach of privacy or release accidentally of, very, secure information or something like that, that's a big one, but I actually don't think that's what the main problem is going to boil down to. I think what it's going to boil down to is when people start looking at, how many children did we leave behind in primary education, and what are the true costs of health care and the efficacy of the drugs that we're using in our everyday lives, and what is the true environmental impact when you take a mountain and stick it into a valley. These are going to be incredibly politically embarrassing pieces of information that come out. And I think, the disaster, if you will, is going to be that there is a huge amount, a huge number, a gargantuan number, a deferred maintenance scope of decades and decades and decades of skeletons in closets all across government agencies all over the place.
And do you think the Obama administration actually wants that out there? I mean, remember in the ask questions to on change.gov, Obama set up this thing, people could ask questions, and the Blagojevich scandal broke right about that, and so people started asking questions like, hey, when did Rahm Emanuel talk to him? And Obama's team kind of removed those questions. Do you think Obama really wants these skeletons, brought up?
I think we want
Mindy,
the
you can follow up on this answer.
We're so sick and tired of all of the spin and crap and just unbelievable statements about the non-issues that we know in our everyday lives are affecting us. That we want the skeletons exposed. We know the skeletons are there. The Obama knows those skeletons are there. Everyone, it's like open secrets of failures of a massive level across government agencies that can't be addressed because we refuse to name the problem. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, in the end, I think actually the Obama administration does want those things exposed because it's the only way we can address these shortcomings in our civil society.
I sense minor panel disagreement based on Mindy shaking her head. So, Mindy, would you please respond to Sasha?
Well, to be fair, I'm in Ellen's camp in that I give the Obama team the benefit of the doubt in that they are taking steps, at least, to just, in demonstrating that they do care about doing things in a different way by having the YouTube videos, by, opening up some of their meetings, transition meetings that they're having, by allowing comments. But to Nick's point, they're also running into an issue when, and this is sort of where my welcome to power comment came in, is the Blagojevich comments were something they did not want to get into. And they didn't want them up on their site, and they didn't want to be held accountable for them, and so they removed them. And as soon as you start removing comments, then all of a sudden you're now responsible for every single comment that's up there, because you've taken this role of mediator or moderator. So I don't, and even I think, again, I think an ounce of action is better than inaction. I really prescribe to that. The question is if all of us in this room and the Obama voters are going to be satisfied with an ounce of action rather than the whole pie, the whole enchilada. And because they're not going to get the whole enchilada, and that's not to be pessimistic, but I think you even can look at the Obama campaign, which was more, allowed open connectiveness and provided opportunities for mass connectedness and mass participation in a way that we have not seen in a presidential campaign. However, who ultimately held the reins, and it was a few people at the senior level of the Obama campaign, and very little high security information, strategic information was released. That was held tight. Now, one could argue that it was very important for them to do that. It was important for them to not play their cards, to open up 50%, and everyone had this feeling of openness, and they were allowed to connect with each other, and because they were debating and they were self-organizing, they weren't as concerned of what the team was doing in Chicago, but ultimately, most of the very important decisions and the strategy was held secret in Chicago, and the question is, can we really expect there's going to be more of openness when it comes to the government in a place where we're not even trying to win a campaign and we're not trying to win people over as much from a PR perspective, we're trying to run a country?
Is that a bad thing? I mean, your previous...
Go ahead.
Actually, let's move to Craig. Craig, you're raising your hand and your eyebrows. So.
Well, as an engineer, I'm not a very patient guy. But I see that in the historical context. Last year, in terms of the transition, well, there was a transition in power, which I kind of view like what happened in 1776, which involved bloggers back then like Thomas Paine or Ben Franklin. 1787, we finally started getting our act really together with this new form of government. A difficult, painful change, and it did take a while to get it right. 2009, I have a feeling is going to be a year like 1787, where we're doing something new. We're experimenting something which is changing the course of human history. And it's an experiment. No one's done it before. There's going to be a lot of good first moves, and there's going to be a lot of missteps. And I think it's gotten off to a really good start. A lot of people are heeding the call and trying to make it work out. To correct something you said earlier, I'm not an activist. I'm trying to participate in this thing. This is like Mindy was implying, most people don't want to be involved with politics. If you're a single parent, putting kids through college, you're not going to have the time or money to be involved. But for those of us who do have the time or money, it's a time to stand up. We're getting involved with this thing. And again, we're seeing that something big and new is happening. If you ever wondered what it was like to live through a historic period, well, you have your chance now.
Well, Craig, let's Sasha, respond to that.
I just want to, I think a lot of this boils down to the salience and the possibility for increasing the salience of government to people's everyday lives. So actually, to push back a little bit on Craig there, I think if you're the single mother putting your kids through college, you would be very interested in being involved in reforms to lessen the cost of a college education for your kids. And we have this opportunity, through online and new media to really make possible engagement in a meaningful way in these processes, in these reforms that are most salient to different constituents.
But is it not true that if you're a single mother putting your kid through college, you might not even have broadband access? 50% of this country doesn't have broadband access. There are hundreds of thousands of people in New York who couldn't even get it if they could afford it and if they could buy computers. So really, you're giving these wonderful benefits, these great things to half the country. Is that a good thing, or is that actually bad for democracy?
Yeah, I mean, we've engaged in decades and decades of deferred maintenance on every infrastructure imaginable, of which broadband is just both one of the newer and also one of the most important in an information age. And it's egregious. I mean, it's one of these areas, it's unbelievable just how little attention we've paid to a vital resource in a digital age.
Ellen, I want you to adjudicate the debate here between Mindy and Craig. So Mindy makes the point that Obama talks about openness, talks about transparency, but actually, it was pretty much lockdown mode from Chicago. I mean, they refused to let 527s advertise for them. The great transparency thing they did is when there was all this upset in the netroots about the FISA bill, they went online and they talked about the FISA bill, but they didn't actually change their position on the FISA bill, so they pretended to listen. Well, they sort of listened and they talked back, but they didn't let them influence it. So is Mindy right? These guys aren't actually transparent, or is Craig right? This is 1787 or 1776, 1848?
It's 2009, I think, is the answer.
That was easy. Okay.
is the answer to this. I think we're confusing a bit the notion of using the new technology to communicate, to engage communities of people with government, and the notion of transparency for government information. I mean, the administration is confusing it, probably deliberately so, but I separate it because my focus is on the transparency side of things, in part because I think it will lead to greater communication. The one point that I wanted to add into this discussion is we're talking as if the Obama administration has to invent everything out of whole cloth. They do not. I mean, I have a list that was given to me, I think, by the Federal Web Managers Council of experiments that are going on in government in places you never heard of today that are using new technology rather successfully in sort of pilot programs. My favorite one, and by the way, I don't think there have been any trolls, there haven't been any serious problems with it, is the peer-to-patent program that's operating at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. This has been hugely successful, so much so that it's expanding throughout that agency. And so the administration doesn't have to invent this out of whole cloth. And I think the notion of a CTO, a CIO, getting these kinds of more experiments and then expanding on the best ones and understanding how they operate. But the challenges are huge, which takes me back to my very first point, which is the notion that transparency, from the transparency point of view, is the responsibility of government. And if we see steps in that direction, not giant leaps off the cliff, but steps in that direction to do it responsibly so that the privacy issues are dealt with, I will be one happy camper, because what happens is we, the citizens, become, we're enamored with transparency. We want to make and the ability to communicate. We want to buy a book at midnight. We want to make a travel reservation at 2 a.m. We want to see who our politicians are getting money from. I want to do it 24/7, just the same. And so our expectation will demand faster and faster implementation by the new administration.
All right. Mindy, I want to give you the opportunity to make Ellen even happier a camper. Tell her the best thing that the Bush-Cheney administration did for open seat transparency or the internet that people don't know about. Because when people talk about the internet and Bush-Cheney in the press, and they usually write about how opaque it was, and Cheney wouldn't allow people to know who he was meeting with. What is something that happened, or that's going on right now, besides peer-to-patent, that's really good and that Obama should continue?
In the government?
Yeah.
It's not fair to put her on the spot.
Yeah, I know. I didn't prepare for that question, so I don't know. I will say though, just to go to, I'm friendly with, I'm not sure if he's here today, the person who was the internet director for a long time at the White House, David Almasy, and he kind of, I know he gets frustrated now when there's a lot of talk about all the things, all the hope and the things that Obama campaign is going to do. Because they did run into a lot of the traps, which I think you're already seeing the Obama campaign run into, which is, the idea of opening up comments. They wanted to open up comments. There's a lot of discussion about opening up comments, but then they came up to the challenge of, well, if it is something that you feel you have to delete, do you run into a First Amendment? Do you run into a First Amendment battle? They also, ran into things where the president could say something in a speech, because the president is allowed to say whatever they want, but then to actually post that or to provide that on the White House website, you're not allowed to do that from a transparency perspective according to the law. So, I think that, to be said, I'm not going to cite a specific example here because I should have prepared for that, but there were people inside the administration who wanted to do a lot of the things that the Obama team is talking about doing now, and ran up against legal challenges or pushback, and perhaps it was from their elders, their bosses within the administration, which is a problem. But I do think one thing that's going to be interesting to follow is, because when I hear like that the Obama team wants to do something, but they're wanting to figure out what the laws is, and what the law is, and what the rules are for the White House, and what the rules are within government. Maybe it's simplistic, but I said, well, why don't they change the rules?
Well, that's a great point. I want to get to this, but Craig, I want you to respond to this.
One area where where new technologies are being used to a positive effect has to do with public diplomacy, because there have been a few folks that state quietly using Twitter and blogging and so on to get out the word to people so that people could interact, say, from the Mideast and here on a more personal basis. Just reminding folks out there that the American people are really still okay, and that we have a lot in common. There are people chatting about how to maintain those efforts, and then how to bring them forward and expand them. So that was pretty positive. Also, there's a few quiet cybersecurity things going on that shouldn't go away. They've been operating in stealth mode because they don't want to attract unwholesome attention.
Now let's talk about these laws that Mindy mentioned. You mentioned David Almasi. He was one of the people who worked really hard to do very important stuff in the Bush-Cheney White House. And I remember hearing a story that he told about one of Bush's speeches. Bush mentioned Red Cross, and so he was putting it up on the website, and he put a link to redcross.org. You know, that's a great thing, help people find Red Cross. And he was told, take that down. You can't sponsor or promote Red Cross. So it was an example of a law getting in the way of somebody trying to do something very good. So let's talk about, I want to open this to all four of you, right? So there are all sorts of laws. There are a few that I know about that prevent you from doing good things. For example, you can't embed YouTube on your site because there's California Terms of Service law, and the Americans with Disabilities Act means you have to provide everything in real time to someone with disabilities, which means you would have to put it in text form at the same time you put it in video form. You know, you can't link to external sites. Let's hear about some of these other laws that make this really hard.
I'll tell the story of something that happened in Congress fairly recently, which is members of Congress have been unable to use social media in any form. They can't embed YouTube videos, they can't use Twitter, they couldn't use Facebook. Well, needless to say, lots of members of Congress have been using these social media outlets illegally. And so the Democrats in the last Congress decided they'd revisit the rule on this. And they came out with a new rule in which they thought they were trying to clarify what members of Congress could actually do and maybe loosen the restrictions a little bit. And the Republicans started to howl because it sounded like they were sort of nailing into place the restrictions. At which point, Sunlight launched a Let Our Congress Tweet campaign on Twitter. And we had several thousand people who signed up within 24 or 48 hours. And whether it had an impact or not, I can't tell you. But 2 or 3 weeks later, the House Democrats reversed the rule, and now members of Congress can actually use social media. The demand, I may be overreaching here to make my point, the demand came from citizens to request that their members of Congress be able to use this new media. We are accustomed to it. We use it. We want to hear from our members of Congress on Twitter, and the ones who actually tweet are terrific at it, and it's fascinating conversation. And I can imagine thousands of constituents following it. So I think the notion of changing the rules in the executive branch, and there's another memo here from the Federal Web Managers Council. I'll just hold it up. Social media and the federal government perceived and real barriers and potential solutions. You'll find it online, just Google it. And there are lots of things that I had absolutely no idea about that are included in here that are real barriers which can be thought through and changed.
I mean, it's kind of amazing if you think that we're talking about having the government set up their own forms of social media, and wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that bring power to the people? And actually, at a lot of these government agencies, you're not even allowed to use social media. You're not even allowed to go on Facebook or YouTube.
Right.
Are there any rules that the other three of you have come into that the CTO should change, that Congress should change, that we need to somehow get rid of so that all this good stuff can go forward? Greg?
The rules and recommendations are, in fact, in the paper Ellen just cited, which is what I was referring to via techpresident.com, which is probably the best resource for this kind of material. The challenging part has to do not with the actual rules, but with cultural conventions, because across the country, at all levels of government, there are many tech people who've been spending some years now in internet culture, which is one of democracy and openness, and the cultural conventions are going to, that's what needs to change, because the tech people involved, the people who've grown up with some of this electronic technology, those are the people facing all this bureaucratic inertia. And I think it's more bureaucratic inertia and versus law that has to be changed. The web managers, I think, are the first indication that my nerdish compatriots are starting to do this. It's unclear what would happen, but for the record, I'd like to welcome our new nerd overlords.
All right, well, speaking of nerd overlords, it's now 1 o'clock in the interest of transparency and two-way conversations. We have 2 microphones. Please come up and ask questions directed at either individuals or the whole panel. Fire away.
That was a good set.
What are they going to say? Because we didn't know. We really didn't know. We just come on in and shoot film. And so the amazing part for us and the humbling part was that 2.5 million people went to the ABC website after the show to talk about us. And we had no idea. what that was. And to watch these shows with my fellow executives who really weren't wanting to watch this show, but were riveted, by each moment. I thought that was an amazing change, a change in the way we look at ourselves. I think the ideas that you present are amazing. So my big question to all of you is really, how do you shepherd, the boomers through this? Because us Xers, we are very comfortable being wrong. People tell us all the time. But it's hard. It's hard to tell someone who's been right and very successful, and deservedly so, for many years, that, these 30,000 people you don't know really don't like your shoes.
So we need old nerd overlords.
I'll just say, I'm glad you asked that question, because the other day, I've been working on a series of projects, and one's called Rebuild the Party, to kind of move the Republican Party into the 21st century, and because one day we probably will, to the distaste of many in here, have a Republican president again. We want to make sure they're doing these things. But anyway, I was criticized on Twitter about, sort of, why don't we stop, because I blog about a lot of these things, why don't we stop blogging about these things and actually do something, And it's a valid point, but I started thinking about it, and I said, you know what, the salesman role, the saleswoman role is just as important, and has been just as important for me as actually sometimes sitting there and creating the technology and, implementing, because you have to get the boomers to buy in. And the one, it's a very hard question. I certainly don't have the complete answer. But what I have found is when you get some of these boomers who are kind of in these executive roles, and they don't necessarily live sort of the life of the average American who's even their age. And so they can't understand why this is important, and they don't believe that people actually spend that many hours a day online and function so much of their life's functions or take place online. But you actually get them using these things. Some of the simple, or onto a site that is doing this well. Even go to a lot of the projects the Sunlight Foundation has been behind, and you find that the great majority of them become addicted and only see positive and don't see negative.
Great.
What we're talking about is a big cultural change. The idea that people should collaborate more, now electronically. The idea is to get the word out, so that's kind of expected. The Obama election did about half the job. Now the rest of it is just making the technology available to everyone and reminding everyone that the internet is about inclusion. Everyone gets to play. It's the biggest tent possible. And that's actually working. It's slow, but it is happening.
Great. To the other side, now we already have 9 or 10 people in line, and we have about 25 minutes, so super quick with the questions and super quick with the answers.
My question is directed to Ellen. It's a cliche in the political science literature that opposition candidates run on a democratic reform and open government platform, and then they get into office, they do some token changes, and then they abandon it pretty quickly. Just a few quick examples in the early 1980s. Yes Minister, great British sitcom. The main character runs on an open government platform. As soon as he gets in power and is a minister, the story is about all the things that happen so that he doesn't implement his open government platform. Contract with America, last moment, just like this moment right now. Gingrich comes in on an open government platform, and within a year, some real important things are done. We hear no more about it. So what is the timeline? Do you have a window of opportunity of a year, 2 years? What do you sense is your window of opportunity to push these issues? And are there any red lines, benchmarks, that if it doesn't happen within that year, that this is more about image management than really pushing this agenda in a sincere way?
I'm looking at the first 100 days. I'm looking for that executive order in the first 100 days that I talked about as an indication of we're taking the use of technology as a communications and transparency tool seriously. To me, that's it. And beyond that, I will look to the CTO and the CIO and the new media managers in various agencies, all of whom I hope pan out, in terms of the implementation of that. I don't have a timeline, but I think what's happened, unlike the contract with America, which fell apart, is that what the Obama political team did was to create tens of millions of people who were engaged in that campaign in more than just giving them political money, although many of them gave them small political money. They created an engaged class. That, in combination with the fact that we are used to being able to monitor and follow, engage, and create communities on Facebook and communicate, involve each other that way, will create a greater watchdog capacity on this administration about fulfilling their promises. I mean, they have a book. If you go to a meeting at the Transition Committee, they have a book of the Obama campaign promises, and they're literally looking at it and saying, okay, we said we'd do that. Can we do it in the first 100 days? Can we do it in the next 6 months? And they're very serious about fulfilling those promises. But all we can do is wait and see and continue to demand that from the administration.
Sasha, can you give me a number? How long, if Obama doesn't do any of the things you wanted, how long till we get the first nasty blog post on SashaMeinrath.com? 100 days? 200?
Oh, not that long.
Probably much faster.
Good.
I think, we're really looking at, the big question mark in my mind is what this stimulus bill looks like coming straight. Right out of the gate, this thing is going to be one of the first things to hit the floor, and it's being crafted by, the Hill folks, but it's being crafted also by the administration. And my hope is that it's indicative of some changes as opposed to just a whole bunch of subsidies. Yeah. And if we tie public interest obligations and meaningful reforms into the free money that we're giving away to folks, I think that will be an indicator of some meaningful change down the road. In terms of how long until the first nasty post, that's really up to the administration.
All right, well, they're on guard. To the right, please.
Bob Shadler, American Foreign Policy Council. I, too, am a cheerleader for openness and transparency and democracy. On the one hand, having spent over 10 years in a foreign affairs agency, I see an enormous amount of stuff that's classified that has no apparent reason for being classified. The best stuff is just intelligent, thoughtful stuff that a journalist or academic might come forward. Some of it's inane. I was chief of staff to an agency head who was flying commercial overseas. His travel plans were classified, yet he wanted to be met by the appropriate dignitaries when he went to Moscow. And so the embassy came back, how can I break the law to get the appropriate Soviet official to the embassy? On the other hand, I think if we get into the weeds, we see a lot of difficulties. Access to the president is one of the most valuable things, as Jack Abramoff recognized. People will pay thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to have a picture. If we talk about the president's BlackBerry, should the database of people who have access to who send him messages be public? Some of them may just want to talk about a basketball game. Some may want to talk about legislation or have ideas. Should that be transparent for the rest of us? Should who messed up the vetting of Bill Richardson? Was it Richardson or was it the Obama people? Should that be transparent as to who really messed up? It's a public business, but I don't know that we would be better off if we knew exactly who did it.
All right, who wants to take this? Craig, you're on the spot because you talked about the BlackBerry.
There are people who are talking about basically pretty much putting everything government does online except for the obviously sensitive stuff. Like I would recommend about making nuclear weapon design transparent. It sounds like a bad idea. And this actually is originally a suggestion from Jeff Jarvis at buzzmachine.com, and I think that's the key. The deal is that it's a cultural matter again, but everything should be made available until you get to stuff which is genuinely sensitive. And I think you can trust people to draw the lines appropriately given the new administration.
Well, and given that they won't give an on-the-record quote to Wired Magazine, I suspect the nuclear war plans and weapon design is not going online.
Well, I believe it's because you're a suspect.
All right, here on the left. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jeff from Georgetown University. If you're arguing for such openness with the data and transparency in government, how do you see the role of elected officials changing in our lifetimes? If the kind of decision-making process is going to be let open to people like you and me?
Mindy, you want to take that? You've been on the outside and the inside.
Well, sure. I appreciate that Ellen kind of drew the distinction between the two things we're talking about, which is transparency in government versus the opportunity for mass communication and mass connectedness, but also made the point that they're related, which is that, it's one thing, and I think we've already seen this a little bit with change.gov, is they'll, put out a video on healthcare and say we want to get your opinion on healthcare and your ideas on healthcare, and that's in some ways that's two-way, but it's not, because there's not the loop. So the next step, and then this is where I think transparency comes in again, is how did the civic engagement and the civic contributions to the policy or whatever it might be, what was the result? Did that actually affect what what the politician did, what the elected official did? And what we're hearing, I'm not so much maybe from the administration, I think their hands are very full, but even in Congress, we're seeing it, I think, on both sides. I particularly know, a lot of the Republican leadership, now that they're a minority, mandating that all of their committee heads, have a feedback loop available through the web, and then actually come back and say how that feedback affected the positions that they've taken. And I would particularly take a look at what's going on right now with the stimulus bill and the stimulus plan, because there's a lot of work being done where certainly I think people from both sides of the aisle are trying to get their hands on what the specifics of that plan are, and on providing open forums for the public to submit their contributions to their questions and what they feel needs to be in the plan, and then the public's then going to be looking for how that affected the steps that the leadership and the members of Congress take.
Right, here on the right.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Todd Wiggins. In the interest of shameless self-promotion, I have to admit I have a blog on YouTube, and I cannot spend one day without going on YouTube. So I wanted to ask, in general, is there a possible innovation that could come out of this current administration that could have commercial applications that any of you could anticipate, given that not only are we looking at potentially greater transparency in government, but in general for all citizenry, being that many of us do have Facebook and Twitter accounts, et cetera. Is there potentially a new technology that could develop out of the Obama administration that, like the internet, developed from government usage that could become widespread?
Fascinating. Anybody? Craig.
Right now, in any organization, a problem is internal communication upwards. You get ahead by telling your boss what they want to hear, and then your boss tells his or her boss what they want to hear. The solution for that seems to be the better use of some of these internal tools, again, discussion boards and wikis, with the ability to do group collaboration and filtering. They're evolving and being built right now, and the most excitement is centered around the Obama administration. Get that going. And of course, this kind of internal discussion happens in any big organization, whether it's government or private. You put that sort of thing in private organizations, and that has the potential for enormous improvement. Because again, I spent 19 years in big corporations, and you could tell for sure that the CEO never heard what was really going on. You introduce this technology, things change.
Can I make a quick point on that, though? I don't want to be pessimistic, but I don't expect, nor would expect them to, and I don't think will happen, the government to invent technology or create a technology or a platform that then would be applied to private practice. I think that many commercial enterprises are already doing much superior things to what the government does. Just take a look at the efficiency of a company like FedEx and the way they allow you to track your packages across the country. We don't have anything like that in the government, and I frankly think that the government would benefit by looking at what a lot of commercial enterprises are doing and taking the technologies they're using because they have profit incentive, frankly, and applying that to government.
Public-private partnership, that's what's happening right now.
Yeah.
Is it not also true, Sasha, that if the government were to, not try to invent something, but if they were to just dump lots of data online, that all sorts of people would take these APIs, take this information, and build great things that would have commercial applications?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the fact remains that the government is one of the largest investors in next-generation products and services and applications and technologies. I mean, if you look at what NSF and National Institute of Health and all of these different grants, billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars being invested in new technologies, it's not really the case that it's all private industry alone. The government is there supporting these sorts of things, helping driving innovation, helping support innovation. And when we've seen across the board economies and countries that really have tech-savvy sectors, when they're really leading the charge, it's because there is this interplay that's happening, and government is actively involved in these things. And it is interesting to hear, like, oh, the government shouldn't be involved, because I'm thinking, like, here we are at this online forum talking about putting everything online. It's like, well, I remember the history of ARPANET. Like, you know, it's very clear that government has played a major role in some of the most important transformative technological developments of recent years.
All right, on the left, and thank you everybody for such great, quick questions.
Hi. Speaking from the cultural context of an old nerd who's never tried any of these social activities, Facebook
Are you a
and
nerd
such.
overlord?
Yeah. I'm concerned about some of the barriers that we kind of sort of skipped over in our view of great transparency and big databases, particularly security and also personal relationships. An example, Project Vote Smart, which started out really great, bipartisan, everybody was contributing on both sides of the aisle. And in the last election or so, more and more people were saying, well, no, I don't want to put my record out there because people might look it up. It was actually becoming very useful. So there are a lot of barriers and fears that we would also have to overcome, not just technological but personal. How would we be dealing with that, especially within 100 days?
Ellen.
I'll certainly take a stab at that as an early adapter of technology. My first computer was the little Mac. What do they call it? I've always called it the little Mac, which I wish I had saved, my first home computer, and made into a flower pot or something, since I just transited to a new one. You know, I think the barriers towards, you know, the cultural, if this is your question, the cultural resistance that Craig and board member has been hammering on, that we see in Washington, the cultural resistance to transparency is just breaking down. You know, the notion that members of Congress should post their official calendars online went nowhere through a campaign that we started in our early days. And now there are 9, 10, 11 members of Congress who actually post their calendars online because they understand that that level of transparency, and this is across the, you know, progressives, liberals, and conservatives, who posted their calendars online because they understand that it is a route to building more trust in their office as an elected representative. The fact that more people are not responding to the Project Vote Smart questionnaires is, that's a resistance that will crumble because the public will say, I want to know, you know, this and that about members of Congress. So I think both in terms of the users of the new technology to find out information, I don't remember the numbers, but Pew reported in the last election, I mean, huge increases in the number of people who are going online for political information. They want it. And so I think, again, there's a change in the users and their expectations, which is happening by leaps and bounds. And the politicians are a little bit further behind, but they get it.
Just make a quick note. I think the change is that the politicians are realizing that if they don't put the stuff online, there's so much demand for it that other people are going to put it online for them. And it may not be accurate, it may not be correct, and it may be with a spin that is against what their agenda is and is ultimately damaging. Yeah. So it's the same motivation they've always had, which is protecting themselves, but they realize that one of the ways to protect themselves is to be open and transparent.
Yeah, one of the things that we're learning too at Sunlight, because in part we fund the digitizing of data, is that we created, we enabled OMB Watch, a nonprofit, to create a database called fedspending.org. Then a law was passed, the so-called Coburn-Obama bill, or was it Obama-Coburn bill, requiring the federal government to do it. And the first thing the federal government did was to go to the nonprofit and say, can we license the data you have so we can get ours up faster? And that happened. Pretty soon, I think government will say, okay, we can build these things ourselves. And so there's some modeling that's going on.
But is it not true, I'll ask you another question about that deal. Is it not true that that deal was held up for 6 months because OMB Watch wanted to give it to the government, but the government can't get anything for free? So they had to go through a contract process. So then the government had to rig the contract process. And then they actually had to go through it 3 or 4 different times until they could finally get the thing to OMB Watch for 1/16 the price they wanted to pay. It was a total mess, right?
Absolutely. It was a nightmare. It was a nightmare. My colleagues there would be glad to obviously have told you the story of it. But the bottom line is it was done once, it would be done more easily the second time, I think, on both sides of that. And the notion that the nonprofit sector was able to model for the government. What's equally just further interesting about this particular story, there are now 2 databases of government grants and contracts. And the one that continues to have the most traffic by far is the one that's run by the NGO. We have not figured out why that is yet.
Interesting. Okay, here on the right.
I proudly introduce myself as Chief Nerd Overlord. I'm Bev Godwin. I'm the director of USA.gov.
She is, in fact, the Chief Nerd Overlord.
And I'm the executive sponsor of the Federal Web Managers Council, and that council is made up of the top web manager of all the major departments and agencies. And there are many, many good things going on in government, sometimes by renegades, but by early adopters and innovators. And I will make sure I get that paper that Ellen referenced that has the good examples out to Craig so he blogs about it, and out to tech presidents, so that no one in this room ever doesn't have an answer to what are some good examples in government. But that said, lots of change needs to happen. We're already seeing change. One is the fact that people on this panel talk about the Federal Web Managers white papers to this group, when for years we couldn't even get our own bosses in some of our agencies to look at them. So that's a huge change. Also, you know, I've been in the government a long time, and when there's a transition, everyone in the agency is so nervous. What are they going to ask? Who are they going to ask? What are they going to ask? And so you have these agency review teams, and the central transition team is sending in questions to each agency. So every agency got a list of questions related to this kind of topic, and one of them was, does your agency block access to your employees to sites like YouTube, Facebook, Second Life, Twitter, etc.? And if so, what is your rationale? The day the questions came out, HUD unblocked Facebook for its employees. And that gets to my question, is that, yes, there's laws and regulations that have to change, and it's not going to happen on January 20th. The people aren't even in power yet, so those will take a while. But there's an awful lot of things that are not laws and regulations. They're different interpretations of laws and regulations that were written before the internet. And it's really what Craig got at. It's the cultural change that is needed. And so I asked the panel, what would you do to change the culture?
Mindy, you wanted to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't answer specifically do to change the culture, although it gets to it, is that even before, when I was talking about the public-private partnership, I didn't mean to imply that the government doesn't do a lot of innovative things and develop technology, but I've heard these horror stories, and it's because of the culture problem, where government, a lot of these agencies, before even looking at what some outside solutions might be that have been developed and integrating into their platforms, they try to create them from whole cloth, which then it becomes a 4-year project, which just delays the goal that they were trying to accomplish. And so, that was sort of the point that I was making. And I think by creating the cultural shift from top down in these government agencies, as Craig got to, and you would start to realize, a lot of people they go to what's worked before, what they've done before, which is hiring 30 new employees to build, a new technology or a new platform, because they assume that, these things don't exist elsewhere. And there's so much good technology out there that is now, is available because of open sourcing, or because of APIs that they can plug into. And so I'd like to see a lot more of that happening. And frankly, it'd be good to get out there, thinking of transparency, what the specific rules are among every single government agency and the White House itself when it comes to integrating with existing platforms and existing technologies.
Yes. Craig?
Just for Bev, live long and prosper.
I have a quick.
Thank you, Craig.
I have a quick answer to Bev's question. I mean, how do you show people that? How do you show government employees that it's okay to do this? Show them that it doesn't hurt. In fact, that it helps them. There's a Republican, very conservative congressman named John Culberson. He is on Twitter constantly. This morning, he was complaining about several pieces of legislation that the Speaker was going to push through the House without due consideration. And so. I think it's certainly fair criticism. He was reelected by overwhelmingly large margins. Those 8 or 9 or 10 members of Congress who post their schedules online, we at Sunlight collect those every day. We put them in Congresspedia, which is our wiki on Congress. And then we decided we'd plot them on a Google map. And lo and behold, what did we find? The members of Congress who were posting their schedules online were actually meeting with people who represented interests in their districts. Well, that's pretty cool. Now, I can't vouch for the accuracy of those schedules, but let's assume the best, they are accurate. I thought that was a pretty neat kind of thing, whereas some of those members have been criticized by their opposition candidates for meeting with particular interests, but it turns out that it was that it was interest that concerned their particular state. They weren't meeting with nefarious Washington lobbyists. They were meeting with people who had an interest in their state. And so I think we have to show elected officials, appointed officials, that transparency can be a good thing about re-engaging citizens, about getting people to trust government and its processes, and that it's good for democracy.
Well, we're down to 5 minutes left because I know some of us have to run to have meetings with nefarious Washington lobbyists. So we will run through maybe 2 questions here on the left.
Regarding the laws that we are talking about that are barriers to doing some of the new things with social media in the White House and in Congress, it seems like I think that one of the reasons why those barriers were erected in the first place is to try to create a barrier between politics and policymaking. And I'd just like to humbly suggest that possibly those arguments that we should separate policy and politics, they're talking about how politics is dirty and it shouldn't be part of our process, but possibly politics is a natural outgrowth of the public participating, and should be, you can't take politics out of politics. That's how we decide stuff. So I just want to get your reactions to that suggestion.
Wants to take that?
I'll just make a quick comment. I think it's always very funny when people say, well, that's policy, not politics. Because, policy making is politics. And, a lot of what we're talking about here with transparency and creating an incentive for mass collaboration, mass participation, and two-way communication, it's not so new. I mean, the internet makes it possible on a much grander scale than ever before, but civic engagement and civic lobbying or grassroots lobbying is not new at all. It's been there since the beginning of our government, and frankly, grassroots lobbying has changed the position that Congress takes on a lot of issues. Look at Social Security reform in the beginning of 2005. Look at the immigration debate that is constantly stopgapped because the different sides are grassroots lobbying, and Congress can't come to a consensus because they can't make both sides happy. So, that's politicking all the time, affecting policy.
Yeah, that's good. Over here on the right.
Hi, my name's Gay Pinder. I'm with the National Conference on Citizenship, and we measure, track, and promote civic engagement. We also publish a publication called America's Civic Health Index, which found that even though 2008 was a banner year for civic involvement, most people didn't have any plans to continue to be involved after the election. And we also found that there is a big trust issue with the government. But we also found that 80% of citizens support changes in policy that will lead to greater involvement, which includes national deliberation. So if we were to build this great mechanism for people to be more involved, if we build it, will they come?
All right, who wants to take that? It's a big one.
This is like the opposite of your question to us, which is, we assume they're going to come, and what are we going to do with these crazy people who come? There is no question, I think, in any of our minds that the answer is, if it is built, will they come? The answer is yes. We've had so much experimentation, including what's going on in government today, to indicate that people will come, they will come and participate responsibly, and that I don't believe that there will be one giant opportunity. I think it will happen in various government agencies, in the White House, in certain sectors, and I think the unequivocal answer is yes, people will come and they will participate.
Great. On the left?
Diane Cornell with Inmarsat. I've got a perfect follow-on question to this last comment. I have a volume question. I'm sure there are a lot of government servants sitting there who have looked at written records and rulemaking proceedings, for example, the legislative process for many years, and it's been a real struggle for them to try and figure out how to evaluate the volume of written information they've gotten. What techniques do you have from the online world that you think are adaptable to government to enable them to take the huge volume of input that they're likely to get and actually be able to sift through it, evaluate it, use it effectively?
Very good question. Sasha.
Sure. I think there's 2 issues here that are very related. One is that we're living today through a shift from a broadcast era to a peer-to-peer era. It's a shift that is encapsulated in the mindset having been, like if you want the two-way flow of communication, you write a letter to the editor. That was about as good as it got. And so this mentality is completely part of the mindset of folks across the board. So if you're of this mindset, you're asking the questions, how do we deal with the flood of information? The alternative is that you think, well, how are we a part of this peer-to-peer generation system, a distributed information flow system, a system of all this different transactions amongst different participants in decision-making and information flow, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you start asking yourself, well, how do we organize people to help us, chunk out this information? How do we make this information salient to the guy in the garage who's going to then chunk through it and figure out like what it actually means? And it's about, in many ways, shifting how we view the problem. It's not that there's too much information, it's that there's not enough people helping us with that information. And it's true, we are generating unprecedented amounts of information as a society per person. Things stick around in ways that they never have before. But we also have tools and friends and compatriots and enemies and whatever else that will help us understand this information. And the second part is, there's two ways to deal with this problem. One is attrition. We lay siege and we wait for people to die. And I think, that might work. It's not the one I would choose, but it's probably fairly effective.
We don't want to end on that note.
Right. So beyond attrition then is the education factor. And that's, that we don't just lay siege, we catapult, Craig and Ellen over the towers and they go in and change things from the inside. But I think it's shown to have been incredibly effective. In a very short period of time, we've not only transitioned as a society, but the same people, in many ways, that have been in power have begun to think differently. And that's very much due to the work of this panel.
All right, so we need to change the way everybody inside thinks and catapult a few people in there. All right, thank you very much. Thank you to Google. Thank you to New America. Thank you to Wired Magazine. And thank you to a fantastic panel.